The Sims 4 team is planning to expand emotions even more. Could this be an improvement or end in disaster? Now, this statement actually goes back to an interview about Sims 4 Lovestruck, which was published on PC Games, but it could tell us what they have going on behind the scenes, both for base game updates and also future DLC. We continue to surprise and delight our players, and we're always listening to their feedback and exploring new spaces to develop expansion packs to further their gameplay experiences. When asked if there are any particular parts of the game they would like to build out further, they specifically said, "One core element of the game that I really want to expand upon is Sims, moods, and moodlets." So first, let's note a few things. First of all, it might happen with expansion packs or alongside expansion packs. After all, as so often is the case, we get some of our biggest base game updates along big packs. There's also some other noteworthy language here. They specifically say that they want to expand moods and moodlets, not inherently change how emotions function in The Sims 4 or make them more or less strong or complex. In other words, they want to add on to things but not necessarily change anything about the way they are programmed. So on one hand, not changing the system is of course less likely to cause catastrophic problems, and I suppose that an overhaul of the entire emotion system of course would take a lot of resources, which they should have. However, I could also see it messing up tons of things. And of course, simply making more isn't inherently better. On one hand, you could argue this is necessary for further pack integration, and certainly there are some good opportunities coming up, I'm sure. However, I'm just not sold on emotions in Sims 4 in general. Emotions were of course a key selling point for Sims 4, but honestly, I've always had mixed emotions, no pun intended. Though I do see that emotions have their place and can even result in changing what kind of creative work, for example, your Sims produce. At the same time, my biggest problem is I have long argued that emotions in Sims 4 take precedent over unique personalities. In many ways, it seems like emotions in Sims 4 can overpower personality traits, and while I acknowledge this of course is a delicate balance, I do strongly feel that emotions still do not make Sims appear well-rounded like they are supposed to. And in fact, how Sims 4 emotions and moodlets were marketed seems to continue to be how they claim they operate now, and perhaps there's a rationale for continuing to focus on this and expanding them in the future. We need only look at past interviews to establish this, especially around 2014 and 2013. Quote, "We've spent a lot of time tuning emotions to make sure it feels right. One of the things we wanted to do was to make sure it was happening. We didn't want Sims to bounce between emotions quickly," which honestly I would argue they actually do. They also wanted to make emotions feel like they mattered and that it wasn't just a whimsical thing, tying it directly to interactions, making sure interactions that surface to you are reinforcing the way your Sims are feeling, and they feel like they have an interaction that a Sim of a particular emotion state would actually do. And there I would argue lies in the problem. While yes, emotions do dictate to a degree how we react, personality also plays a key role. And in fact, one's personality would dictate how much emotions would actually sway them, as well as of course other circumstances. Now of course, capturing this nuance perfectly is very complex. Human beings are highly complex, but I would still argue that emotions are really taking over in Sims 4, and we notice the unique personality types a lot less. Past interviews argue the exact opposite of my assertion. They tell you that they were sad or depressed or angry or confident, and it's going to have a big impact on your gameplay. It's really about making Sims more believable, like real beings, but also has an impact on gameplay. It's a case of making sure the game is a life simulation to the extent that it feels relatable, but also making sure it feels enough of a fantasy, funny, quirky moments that is never too dark that the game feels uncomfortable to play with. They also claim that they were trying to avoid the issue of feeling like a binary state where your Sim goes from feeling one thing to another. Again, I would argue they did not accomplish this. Now, I'm not saying nothing has improved in terms of Sims personalities or emotions over the years. It's kind of been back and forth in my humble opinion. However, notice they also are talking about fantasy, and I think this is what's really interesting here. They said they were trying to make Sims more believable by focusing on emotions, yet at the same time they are asserting they're wanting to make sure that Sims 4 doesn't get too dark. This also ties into this interview statement just this past year. The Sims 4 reflects an optimistic outlook on life. The real world holds so many different experiences that it's hard to imagine reaching a point where we as developers feel like we've explored all things possible. Now, in some ways, one can argue that the Sims franchise always has blended realism and whimsy. And yes, of course, in some cases, in many instances, it is more optimistic. After all, real life has some pretty brutal brutal components to it. However, I would argue that Sims 4, so to speak, is the most optimistic of Sims games by far. I would argue that you can add whimsy and light elements and not get super dark, but still have more consequences and still have elements of darkness. I would actually say the last expansion pack does this a bit more, and that's why I appreciated it. And of course, there are people that play Sims 4 that don't want any darkness whatsoever. In my opinion, it always has felt kind of unbalanced, and it seems to me, especially with the focus on going with more moods and moodlets, we do still tend to focus on the positive side of things. So I will say, I don't know how I feel about this. I just think moods and moodlets have never impressed me in Sims 4, and what they're going to do to expand it is going to be very interesting to see. There was a post in a Facebook group that made me laugh. It said, the biggest problem with Sims 4 is that emotions are not realistic, and personalities are not in depth. And while I agree with that, they said, if this was fixed, The Sims 4 would be a brilliant game. Now here's the problem with that statement. In my opinion, that's the heart and a core of a game. However, of course, that is subjective. That's what's most important to me. For other people, it could be other features. But yes, fixing that would definitely transform the game completely. I just don't know how possible that is. And that's why I always argued that I wanted a fifth Sims game, a true fifth Sims game, because I would like to start over at the very core. And honestly, I'm not one of those people that think the past Sims games were perfect, and I do not think the past Sims games were better than Sims 4 in every single way. However, I do notice sometimes the marketing around Sims 4 really mischaracterizes the past games. For example, in this past interview, I really think it goes back to The Sims. When we think about our Sims and what we focused on for Sims 4 was changing how they feel, how it feels to interact with them, and how they live in the world around them, and how much more natural it is. Really, if you go back to previous Sims games and you start to play them and examine them a little bit more closely, the Sims were really robotic in the way they operated and moved and behaved in previous games, and it's much more natural now. Honestly, I could not disagree with that statement more. Yes, there are some things that Sims 4 does better, and I do want to cover that in a future video. However, I would not say that Sims were robotic in the second or third Sims game, which are the games I have personally played. Yes, in the third Sims game, they definitely didn't have the best expressions, I'm not gonna lie about that, but to me, it's not just about their facial expressions. I would also argue that Sims 4 facial expressions are a bit exaggerated. In terms of how Sims behaved, I like both Sims 2 and the third Sims game. I found it more believable. Again though, I'm not focusing on facial expressions, I'm focusing on how these Sims interact with other Sims and of course how they react in other situations. Overall, I do think there have been improvements to Sims 4 in autonomy and also just how Sims interact, but I disagree with this characterization of past Sims games, and I am a little bit skeptical about the focus on moods and moodlets. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.